Hello, my name is Louise MacLeod and I've been an English teacher for around 10 years now. I got involved with Scottish online lessons because I really enjoy making resources and I love the idea of giving young people access to materials that they can use with complete autonomy. I've always loved learning, particularly in English, which will probably come as no surprise, but I firmly believe that you can get better at any subject with the right teacher and the right mindset. One of my favourite aspects of English to teach is probably poetry. It's especially fun with BGE classes because you don't have to worry about exams and you can just focus on enjoying the poems. Here is a lesson I created for third level English to teach and explain the basics of poetry analysis.
Hello and welcome to this BGE reading skills lesson on studying poetry. In today's lesson you'll learn how to understand the structure and language of poems, and by the end you should be able to identify the features that make a poem, and you'll be able to confidently discuss the language and structure of poetry. How to read this presentation. The pencil icon on the screen means that you should take a note of the information on the slide. Remember, keep your notes nice and clear and organised so that you can refer back to them in the future when you revise. When a slide asks you to summarise what you've just learned, take a minute to jot down everything that you remember from the previous section or activity. There might also be questions so that you can direct your notes a wee bit more. And then finally, you might spot a pause button on some of the slides. Press pause on the video to give yourself enough time to work through the task on screen. We might also include a time limit if we think you're ready to work under timed conditions. If we do include a time limit, pause the video and set a timer. It's a great way to measure and improve your efficiency and your timekeeping. To start, it's worth asking ourselves what is poetry, since that's what we're going to be studying in today's lesson. On the next slide, you'll see a list of comments that describe poetry and poems and poets. Your task is to draw a pyramid like the one on the screen and then rank the descriptions of poetry from best at the top to worst at the bottom section. So you're going to write out which ones you like the best at the very top and the ones that you think don't apply as well to poetry at the very bottom. So you'll probably take a whole page to do this. So feel free to pause right now and draw out your pyramid. Now that you've drawn out your pyramid, you should be able to take all the statements that are on the screen just now and write them out in order of which ones you think are the best. So just pick one or two to go at the very top because there's not that much room at the top of a pyramid. And then the worst ones can go at the very bottom and there's more room down there, so you can put a few more at the very bottom of your pyramid. And this will help you to start thinking about what is poetry and what you define poetry and poems as. So pause the presentation, write down your descriptions now, and then we'll move on. As you already know, in today's lesson, we're going to be looking at how to describe and discuss poetry. And that means there are going to be a number of poetic terms to learn. These techniques might sound complicated and confusing at first. Some of them have really long and complex sounding names, but they're actually quite simple. And in fact, the name is usually the trickiest part. So when looking at new words and terms, it's important not to be turned off by a complicated name, which English is full of, unfortunately. A very simple object or idea can actually have a very complicated name. So focus on the idea, not on the name, especially if the name is really complicated. The first poetic technique we're going to look at is the use of sound effects in poetry. You may or may not know, but poetry is really meant to be read aloud and heard by an audience rather than just read from a page. So your task is to look at the pictures in the following slide and write down a list of all the sounds that you can hear when you look at it. You don't need to worry about spelling. In fact, if you'd like to, you can even invent some words to describe the sounds. There's one below here that you can see on the screen. So for example, boom and rustle may be words that you've heard before, but drr and skrish are just made up words that I think sound in my head when I see this image. So you feel free to make up any words you want to. Here are the 4 pictures for you to invent or write down some sounds that come to mind when you see them. So just write a list of all the sounds you can hear when you look at each picture. You can write as many as you want. And again, don't worry about spelling and feel free to invent some words. Pause the presentation and write down as many as you can. When poets do what you just did and use words to describe the sound of an action, this is called onomatopoeia. And as you've just demonstrated, onomatopoeia is a pretty simple technique. We can even invent our own words to use it. It does have a long, complicated name though, maybe the longest, most complicated name that we'll look at today. So to help us remember it, we're going to put our description into a word box. And you can see our definition is here on the screen right now. It says, onomatopoeia, when a word describes the sound of an action. So what do I mean by a word box? Well, we can create our own virtual word box by writing our definitions down in a document on the computer, or you could take a page of your notes and title it with word box and then write your definitions down in there of all your key terms. Or you could make an actual word box, take an old box or an old pencil case and turn it into a space for you to put definitions in, write them down on little pieces of paper, and then you can pop them in there. It's a great way for learning new terms and remembering difficult words that you've maybe not heard of before or that you tend to forget. Let's see how well we can study onomatopoeia then. You'll see a poem on screen. It's called Rain Dance Poem by Victoria Riom. I want you to read the poem and then identify any examples of onomatopoeia that you can spot. Then identify what the writer is describing with her use of onomatopoeia. And finally, explain why you think she's chosen to use onomatopoeia rather than describing her subject in another way, maybe by stating exactly what it is. Why has she used these sound words in order to get across what's happening in the poem? Pause the presentation and try to answer those 3 questions. Onomatopoeia isn't the only technique poets use to create sound effects though. If you look at the following excerpts from song lyrics on the screen, you might spot something that they all have in common. Feel free to pause the presentation and think about that just now. Maybe you've already worked it out, you've read through each of them. You might notice that a lot of them have combinations of words that start with the same sound. Why do you think that they've been written in this way? Why do we have these repeated sounds? Like for the first time in forever, we've got that f sound repeated at the beginning of several words. Or maybe now we've got bad blood has that b sound repeated at the beginning of several words. Why do you think they've been written in that way? When poets use multiple words that begin with the same consonant sound and they put them close to each other in a line or a sentence, this is called alliteration. And as with onomatopoeia, alliteration is a really simple technique that affects the sound of the poem and actually even creates a sense of rhythm, which is why you see it in song lyrics so often. To help us remember alliteration then, just like onomatopoeia, we're going to put our description into the word box. Again, yours might be a sheet of paper, it might be a document on the computer, it might be an actual box or bag that you've created. And you can see the little definition here that we're going to put into it. Alliteration, when words close together in a line or sentence begin with the same consonant sound. Let's see how alliteration works in poetry then. On the screen on the right, you'll see an extract from a very famous poem called The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Read it through carefully and then answer the following questions. A. What do you think this verse is about? B. What consonant letters or sounds are repeated in this poem? Do any words begin with the same sound but not the same letter? For example, a word beginning with PH will make the same sound as a word beginning with F. And C. How does the writer's use of alliteration and sound help them to tell the story? So you need to make sure you've answered A before you can answer C. Pause the presentation just now and try to answer those questions. Before we move on, in your notes, try to summarise what you've just learned in the first section of today's lesson. First, why is sound important to poets? Next, what techniques can writers use when they create sound effects in poetry? Think about the 2 techniques we've looked at today. And finally, could you create a short description of something you can hear right now using these techniques? Try and listen to what's going on in the room or the world outside and think about how you could describe that using the different sound techniques we've looked at today. Pause the presentation and try to answer these questions in your notes before moving on. Let's talk about comparisons now. On the next slide, you'll see some pictures of different people, feelings or places, and next to them will be little sentence starters. I want you to finish the sentences by finding interesting and creative comparisons that you feel describes the picture well. There's an example on screen now so you understand what I mean. So we've got these piles of powder dyes and we could describe them by saying the powders were as bright as a field of fresh spring flowers. So that gets across how colourful they are. You're going to have a go at doing this on your own on the next slide. Here are the 4 pictures for which I want you to try to write your own comparisons. The first one is a picture of a chap on his phone, and the caption says people and their phones are alike, so I want you to think of a good comparison for that. The next one, he was as strong as, again try to finish off that comparison. Next, the panther was dark like. And then finally, school is as boring as. Even if you don't find school boring, try to think of a good comparison for that one. You can feel free to change the sentences a little bit if you'd like to, as long as they still have a comparison within them. Even if you want to pick out a different thing from the picture to use as the main subject of your sentence, that's totally fine, as long as you're writing a comparison. Pause the presentation just now and try to get 4 sentences written. The task you've just completed was probably quite easy for you, and that's because we're quite used to describing our ideas with comparisons. Using comparisons allows us, and poets, to communicate lots of information without using too many words. And if you think about poems where we don't use too many words at all, it's quite useful to be economical with what we say. Instead of explaining, we put an image into the mind of the reader. And that's why this technique of using comparisons to create a good description is called imagery. And we've got a little definition on the screen here for you to pop into your word box as well. It says imagery, using comparisons to paint a picture in the mind of the reader. Let's look at imagery in a poem then. Read this extract from the poem The Warm and the Cold by Ted Hughes, and then A, choose your favourite comparison from the poem and write it down. Then try to explain what the writer is comparing with that image, with that comparison, what is being described. And finally, why does the writer describe his subject using a comparison? So why not use a different way of describing this same thing? Why use a comparison? Why is that better? And why has the writer chosen to do that? Pause the presentation just now and try to write your 3 answers. The type of image used in the Ted Hughes poem that we just looked at, and in your own examples from earlier, make it really clear that a comparison is being used. You use phrases like or as to make it really obvious to your reader. This type of imagery then, when the comparison is stated directly, is called a simile. And I've popped on the screen here that it's not a smiley. Try to spell it correctly if you can. This is one of the most common types of imagery in popular culture. You'll find it comes up in song lyrics quite often, and you might even think of your own example from a song that you like already. There's a little description on screen now for you to pop into your word box. It says simile, a type of imagery in which the writer compares 2 things using phrases such as like or as. It doesn't always have to be exactly those phrases, but as long as that comparison is made really obvious to the reader, then the writer is using a simile. So make sure you've got that in your word box, and then we'll move on. With similes, it's easy to tell that the person or the thing that you're describing isn't actually what you're comparing them to, because you're making it really clear to your reader. However, if we miss out like or as or any of those phrases, what difference would it make? As a little example, take one of the similes that you made up earlier, about the people on their phones or school being boring, and then try taking out the like or the as. Try describing it as though one thing is the other. Does the sentence still make sense, or does it change the meaning? Do that just now. Think about it before we move on. Let's look at how the writer uses imagery in this poem called Do I Know You by Michael Rosen. Read through the poem carefully and then try to answer the following questions. First, how does the speaker feel in this poem, and how do you know this? Next, try to choose a comparison the writer uses to tell us how he feels. And finally, describe what's being compared with this comparison, and try to explain how this tells us how the writer is feeling in this poem. Pause the presentation, try to answer those questions before moving on. As you can see then, you don't always have to use like or as or phrases like those to make a comparison. In fact, sometimes it's actually better not to. Why do you think that is? The type of imagery Michael Rosen used in the poem we just looked at is a metaphor. With metaphors, the writer is still comparing 2 things. They're just phrasing it like one thing is the other, even though they aren't really. This is a more sophisticated technique. Sometimes it's harder to identify, and then sometimes it's also harder to explain why it's being used, but we'll get better at it the more we do that. There's a wee description on the screen just now for you to pop into your word box before moving on. It says metaphor, a comparison in which one thing is described as being another rather than simply like it. So make sure you get a note of that before moving on. Let's look beyond similes and metaphors now. A task for you is to look at any object, non-human, in the room and write down a sentence describing the way it looks or sounds as though it is human. This might be tricky, so don't worry if it takes you a few minutes. If you're feeling confident though, try to think of and write down a description for at least 3 different non-human things that you can see. For example, the sun creeps through the window. This makes the sun seem like it is a human moving slowly into the room, so we're describing the sun as though it is human. Pause the presentation just now and try to get at least one description written down. Writers, and specifically poets, will often give objects or ideas human qualities to make a more expressive and descriptive point. After all, it's much easier for humans like us to relate to things that are like us. This technique is called personification, so it's almost like turning something into a person, and it's a special type of metaphor in which the poet describes non-human things as if they have human qualities or as if they are alive. A little definition for you to pop into your word box is personification when the poet describes a non-human thing as having human qualities, actions, thoughts, feelings, or habits. Pop that down before moving on. Here we see a really good example of personification in this poem by Herbert Asquith. Read through the poem carefully and then try to answer the following questions. A. What human qualities is the sea given in this poem? B. What human characteristics is the cliff given? C. Why does the sea have a laugh? D. Why do you think this poem is called The Frowning Cliff? And finally, can you try to explain what will happen in this poem based on how it ends? Before moving on to the last part of today's lesson, try to summarise what you've just learned. First, why are comparisons so useful for poets? Next, what are the different types of imagery that we've looked at today? And finally, could you try to write a description of yourself using imagery? Even if you can just think of one simile or metaphor to describe yourself, try to write it down just now before moving on. The last thing we're going to look at today is structure. By now, you're probably quite used to the fact that poems look very different to other types of text like plays or novels. So in your notes, write down everything you know about the structure of a poem, what it looks like, how it should be written on the page, how you would write a poem if you were going to write one just now. Think about how it's different to other types of text. Try to write something down before you move on. As we've seen from all the examples from today's lesson, poems are written in lines, and the normal rules of language or grammar are often broken in these. We've also seen that poems are usually organised into stanzas, which are like the paragraphs of the poem. Each stanza will often deal with a slightly different topic or idea. Each stanza is split into lines, as we mentioned, and then each line will be made up of a number of beats or syllables. You can count these by breaking the word down into single beats. In fact, counting syllables is like monitoring your heartbeat, 16 syllables. So we've got 1 beat per syllable. Hopefully that makes sense. We looked at quite a few different terms there to refer to structure, so let's make sure we have a note of these in our word box before moving on. First, stanza, a section of a poem like a paragraph in which the writer focuses on a specific idea or topic. Next, line or line length, a smaller section of a poem. Poets might change the length of lines to give the poem a different rhythm or to emphasise a specific word, so they'll put a certain word at the beginning or the end of a line, whether that's the end of the sentence or not. And finally, a beat. This is the same as a syllable. Poets might use a specific number of beats in every line of a poem, or they might write more freely and use a different number of beats in each line, a little bit more like they are speaking to the listener or the reader. Lots of other types of text use techniques like imagery or sound effects, so it's really a poem's structure that makes it so different to other types of writing. And poets will often change their poem structure to create an interesting rhythm or sound, much like a songwriter would. I want you to read through this poem on screen now. It's called Noise, and then answer the following questions. A. How would you describe the rhythm of this poem if you could? For example, think about the number of beats in each line. Can you count each of them? Do you notice any patterns? Do you notice any repeated words? Next, not every poem rhymes, so how does the poet use rhyming words to make this poem enjoyable? And finally, why do you think the poet uses the same line at the beginning and the end of the poem? What are they trying to emphasise to the reader? Poets can create a satisfying rhythm to their poems by using rhymes at the end of each line and also by repeating words and phrases. The technique of repeating words is called, as you would imagine, repetition. You might be able to think of some examples of repetition from songs that you like or from TV adverts. Let's put a wee definition of repetition into our word boxes then. Repetition, when the poet uses the same word more than once in a line or stanza to create a satisfying rhythm or sound, or to emphasise the word. Before finishing up today, try to summarise what you've just learned in this section. First, why is it important to understand the structure of poems? Next, what are some features of structure that you've learnt today? And finally, do you prefer poems with an organised structure and lots of rhyming, or do you like poems that sound more like stories or like a conversation? Try to answer these questions before finishing up. Let's check in with today's success criteria then. First, I can identify the features that make a poem. Yes. And then I can confidently discuss the language and structure of poems. Yes, you can do that too. Make sure you check in with yourself about how you feel regarding today's lesson. Remember, you can always go back through the lesson if you found anything difficult or you want to repeat any tasks. Well done on completing today's lesson, especially if you don't really like poetry. If you do though, and you've been bitten by the poetry bug, head over to the poetry writing lesson in the writing section on the website and try creating your own poem now.